Welcome to the podcast of the Political Page blog with commentary from an attorney and entrepreneur on the political and social issues of the day, from a rationalist, libertarian, and often irreverent perspective. This is Political Page, and here's what's on my mind today. Hello and welcome to the podcast of the Political Page blog. This one was dated the 17th of August, 2019, and it's entitled Juden, Verboten, Progressives and the Other Racism. You know, one has to hand the genital hats and their accomplices in the hysterical media this. They do not give up. With the embarrassing demise, if not the complete U-turn of the Russia debacle, they threw out some anti-missile chaff with mutterings of further investigations to come and neatly pivoted to the old distraction du jour, racism. This was necessary. Donald Trump can no longer be considered by anyone with a brain, thus excusing Alexandra occasional cortex, of being a Russian agent. In fact, the investigation has now entered its second phase, wherein the investigators are being investigated to determine whether they jumped the shark so completely as to constitute an attempted coup. And the media is channeling its inner Elmer Fudd and has suddenly gone very, very quiet about all things Putin. I mean, seriously, when's the last time you saw a New York Times headline about Putin? The whole reason of existence of the American media has crashed and burned in such a spectacular funeral pyre of daft conspiracy theory, and what is emerging looks like a very real conspiracy. Only this one implicates only the deep state denizens of the progressive left. And like a panicked owner keeping Fido from that tempting pile of poo he's eyeing at the dog park, the media is desperate to toss out a distraction for us. Anything at all. Look, a squirrel! Now, the first failed squirrel was the whole Epstein thing, briefly thought by the media to have been of use, in that Trump, when a Democrat in the 1990s, briefly cozied up to the nasty and now conveniently suicided pedophile, as did all the other rich socialites in Palm Beach and New York. Now, that one crashed and burned as well when it became known that Trump found the guy to be such a sexist creep that he was banned from Trump properties for sexual assault allegations, not to mention the disclosure of the embarrassing progressive who's who of political muckety-mucks that flitted about the planet on the Lolita Express to Orgy Island, including no less than the Democrat governor of New Mexico, every major billionaire Democrat donor of note, and even former Senate leader George Mitchell, all of whom may be innocent, who knows, but the cherry on the top of the humiliation sundae for the progressive left is the appearance of former president and Democrat icon William Slick Willie Jefferson Clinton, who not only allegedly rode on the Lolita Express up to 27 times and visited the island, but actually has, you could not make this stuff up if you tried, a portrait of himself hanging at Orgy Island, in which the former leader of the free world is immortalized in drag, wearing the infamous blue dress and a pair of kick-ass red pumps. It's called Parsing Bill. It is a masterpiece of irony, but not one the Democrats want sticking in the American consciousness as we enter 2020. That squirrel is very dead. Time for another squirrel. It may be an elderly squirrel, it may dodder and climb that tree with the aid of a walker, but it is a reliable one. Donald Trump is a racist. Again. Now, what makes Donald Trump a racist this time is left a little bit vague, okay? Well, there's that whole concept of securing the border. That's a facile one, isn't it? But unfortunately, it's a tad flimsy given that the other Democrat icon, nay, beyond an icon, the godling Barack Obama, was the one who actually came up personally with the idea of building the infamous cages, deported more migrants than any president did in recent history, and gave border security speeches that make a Trump rally look like a meeting of Code Pink. So that one kind of falls apart. Then there's the whole meme that tax cuts, he did have tax cuts, right? They are racist. Again, it's a simple concept. Once you accept the Biden doctrine that all white people are rich and all people of color are poor, even if they are, quote, just as smart. Now, wealthier people pay taxes. Poor people are excused from taxes. Poor people, he says, are more colorful, ergo, tax cuts must be racist. Yeah, but the whole problem with that is that under Trump and those tax cuts, African Americans are doing pretty much better than they have at any time in history. Still, racism, that squirrel is a hoary old warrior. He's got some legs remaining to it. Might as well go there. I mean, it beats the Epstein strangling himself with a bedsheet headlines, right? Racism, it is what is for breakfast, above the fold in your New York Times morning newspaper. But the problem with racism charges, they are untrustworthy and confounding little rodents, and they bite both sides. Which brings us to the other place that the left is going lately, both in America and in Europe, antisemitism. One might call it the other racism. And that one the news is being a bit more quiet about, but let's look at it anyway, shall we? And so let's start here with one of the weirdest dichotomies in American politics, and that is the fact that between 70 and 90% of American Jews have voted Democrat in every single national election since the Great Depression. While comprising only 2% of the U.S. population, Jewish donors provide over half of all funding to the Democrat Party. In short, Jewish voters are the kind of loyal base of voters which Republicans could only dream of having. And the reason that I consider this a dichotomy is that the Republican Party consistently is the one that supports Israel and opposes anti-Semitism. And it's the Democrat Party, just as consistently, which channels the foulest anti-Semitic rhetoric and anti-Israel policies that the world has enjoyed seeing since the Third Reich. So you ask, put your numbers where your mouth is? Okay, how about this for some statistics? Pew Research did a survey in 2018, found that 79% of Republicans support Israel over the Palestinians. When it comes to Democrats, only 29% support Israel over the Palestinians. Gallup, just this spring, found exactly the same thing. It found that people who describe themselves as conservative Republicans are 81% in favor of Israel. Guess how many people who describe themselves as progressive Democrats support the Jewish state? You ready for this one? 3%. 3%. Flip that stat on its head. 97% of progressive Democrats are anti-Israel. Now, few Americans have time to look into this in that kind of detail. I mean, they're not looking at who votes for what in Congress or what kind of opinion polls there are on foreign policy. But at some point, the subterranean anti-Semitism of the American and global left erupts into the public consciousness. And such was the event this week. A major kerfluffle involving the two most anti-Semitic Democrat members of Congress. And I know it's a competition. I would say it's Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. And Israel made it to the front pages of even the most reluctant media. See, Omar and Tlaib, and again, I'm probably pronouncing her name wrong. I have a hard time when you put two consonants together. Tlaib, applied for visas to travel to Israel, ostensibly to visit the elderly grandmother of one of them. Now, Israel is quite irritated with both congresspersons, Congress entities, because they support this complete economic destruction of Israel through a global boycott movement known as BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. And Israel, because they have a 2017 law which says that anybody who supports that can't come in, banned them from coming in. Now, it soon became apparent that the planned visit had very little to do with poor old grandma and a great deal to do with a planned agenda of visiting major urban Palestinian population centers in Jerusalem and the West Bank, seeing self-styled international human rights groups and Palestinian, quote, activists. The trip now was organized by this group called MIFTA. Now, it's a nonprofit pro-Palestinian organization that purports to, quote, support democracy, but it also supports suicide bombers, describing them in glowing terms as sacrificing their lives for the cause, gleefully counting the number of dead and mutilated Israeli innocents that are blown into smithereens by each honored sacrificial lamb. And speaking of sacrifices, MIFTA is also a leader among those spreading what Jews know as the, quote, blood libel, that the marks on Jewish doors at Passovers are the blood of sacrificed Christians. It's a nice group of folks. Now, none of these anti-terrorist groups, incidentally, included poor old grandmother, who's like 90-plus years old, lives out in the countryside, and when they finally got a hold of her and interviewed her, she said that if her granddaughter were to visit, she hoped they would pick some figs together. In fact, when Israel relented and granted permission for a humanitarian visit to Grandma, they flatly refused to go. Apparently, Grandma will have to pick her own figs for now. Maybe if she blew herself up, they'd come. I don't know. But what the association with MIFTA isn't the only discomfiting twinge of anti-Semitism to besmirch Congress entities Tlaib and Omar. No. Both have a history of truly breathtaking insights on race and history. Tlaib, for example, literally wrapped herself in a Palestinian flag on election night. Divided loyalty, surely you jest. And she isn't anti-Israel, not at all. She is accepting of history. Here's a quote from her. "There's always a kind of calming feeling, I tell folks, when I think of the Holocaust," she explains. Because it was her people, you see, who, quote, provided the safe haven at the expense of their, and I'm quoting again, lives, livelihood, and human dignity. Right. That sounds calm, doesn't it? Omar, not to be outdone, added this little gem of left-wing tolerance. Quote, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. And she's warned that Israel has too much control over the United States government because, you see, it's, quote, all about the Benjamins, baby. See how clever that was? She took that Nazi propaganda about Jews being in charge of all the governments because of their dirty money, and she packaged it as like millennial slang, the Benjamins, baby. Isn't that great? I mean, she's just another millennial progressive helping us all progress. Nothing anti-Semitic here, folks. Just move right along. And then there's always the trope that Nancy Pelosi, that champion of all people Jewish and all donations received therefrom, is restraining the more anti-Semitic members of her tolerant caucus. After all, when Omar suggested that the American government was being controlled by Jewish money grubbers, Pelosi forced her to issue an apology, well, of sorts. She sort of said she wasn't aware that singling out Jews for demonization was like a thing. And of course, Pelosi immediately followed that up by demanding the Republicans apologize and return to Omar for pointing out that she was anti-Semitic. Because pointing out that she's anti-Semitic is, wait for it, racist. But Omar and Tlaib, as repulsive as they are, and even the craven Pelosi, they are not the real face of the Democrat Party. They simply mirror it, okay? It's an interesting experiment. Listen to this one. A filmmaker back in 2014, I think it was, he went to UC Berkeley and he stood there with an ISIS flag and he received, some people ignored him, some people reacted, they gave him fist bumps, they gave him thumbs up, smiles from the students. So next, he picked up an Israeli flag. The result? To quote the report, quote, all hell broke loose, invective, insults, accusations that Israel committed psychological genocide of the planet, viciousness. And that's the truest base of the Democrat Party, the enlightened, college-educated, progressive youth of America. And they are supplemented by minorities who are still being told that that employment and upward mobility are some kind of mirage, and by rock-solid, constant support from Jewish Americans. Now, ISIS, of course, mutilates women, stones gays to death, literally crucifies anyone who doesn't subscribe to fundamentalist religion and doesn't know the meaning of the word democracy. Israel, in contrast, is a secular democratic country. It protects the rights of minorities, gays, and women, and the Democrat base overtly prefers ISIS to the Jewish state. And amazingly, astoundingly, bizarrely, the Jews who support them with such dedication and loyalty don't seem to care about that at all. But listen, American Democrats are not alone in their increasingly open anti-Semitism. The equally progressive, and much admired European Union has come up with a wonderful idea, too. They're going to require marks on all products from Israel, labeling them as coming from a Jewish state. Maybe they could take a page from 1939 Germany and just make up some little yellow stars of David. I mean, Omar is recycling some really nice Nazi propaganda successfully. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. Oh, but wait, isn't that racist? I mean, like truly, dangerously, terrifyingly racist? No, progressives can't be racist, silly. Look, over there, a squirrel. Thank you for tuning in to the Political Page podcast today. Original blog articles, complete with a lot more information and great links to original source material, can be found anytime on politicalpage.net. That's political, P-A-I-G-E.net.